Well, to the latest on the taverns now. You saw the breaking news in the headlines. 2 arrests being made for what happened in KwaZulu-Natal. 21 people dying in 3 separate incidents over the weekend. Now a new conversation around the guns that were used in the attacks. And at least 2 of these tavern attacks, men pulled up in a car and just started shooting people in the tavern, then got back into the car and made off. 15 people dead in just 1 attack in the Newzroom informal settlement in Soweto. Dr. Guy Lamb's a criminologist in the politics department at the University of Stellenbosch. Dr. Lamb, good afternoon to you. As I understand it, there are around 1.6 million people licensed to use guns in South Africa. That's a large number, but I'm presuming that crimes are committed generally by people who don't have a gun license. How are they getting these guns?
Well, indeed, that's correct. I mean, most types of violent crime are committed with people with unlicensed or illegal firearms. Most firearms that are used in crime are largely internally sourced. So historically, there have been firearms which have been in circulation for decades. You know, certainly sort of semi-automatic and fully automatic weapons and some handguns. But most of the guns that are in circulation have largely been acquired from legal or licensed gun owners. So it's either from civilians who have licensed firearms, or from the police, or from private security personnel, private security companies, or sometimes from the military, sometimes from correctional services. So there's a combination of factors. I mean, previously we used to have guns that came across from Mozambique, but those have largely been destroyed and kind of collected. So we don't have much cross-border happening. Most of the weapons that are used in crime are internally sourced.
So these are guns that are stolen, basically?
They're stolen or they have been lost. So, I mean, it's difficult to determine that because, for example, if you're a firearm owner, whether you're a civilian licensed firearm owner or you're a police member or a soldier, and you lose your firearm, you know, due to negligence, you got drunk and you left it in a bar, then the consequences are quite serious. There's kind of, you know, criminal proceedings that can be followed against you. But if your firearm is stolen, then there is no real consequences for you essentially around that. It's not your fault. The gun was stolen from you, so therefore there are no kind of criminal consequences unless you were shown to be negligent.
You say that some of the guns come from the military and the police. I would have thought they'll be very careful about guns. I would have thought that, I mean, not just training, but there'll be procedure, there'll be don't take a gun off a base, that kind of thing. I mean, I know often, every weekend almost, a police officer is sometimes killed just for their gun.
Yeah, I mean, and it's largely, the police are certainly far more targeted than the military. I mean, if we're looking at where weapons are being lost or stolen, it's mainly private citizens. I mean, we're in the sort of thousands there. I mean, the police are responsible for losing about 500 a year. And of course, you know, police are targeted. Police stations have been targeted, particularly in rural areas. And, you know, kind of police have access to a lot more guns and a lot more access to ammunition. And, you know, it's more easier to gain access to a police station, particularly in sort of rural areas where security is lax, than to access bases. But we have had, you know, thefts at bases, for example, at Simonstown. In recent years, there have been thefts there in the Khayelitsha, at the infantry battalion base in Khayelitsha. We've seen some thefts happening there. So, you know, the military is also at risk too.
And then I imagine there's also organized crime. So organized crime would make a point of trying to maybe get into a private security company or into a police station to steal guns, even guns that have been actually handed in through an amnesty or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've seen organized crime being quite prominent in all of this. So we've seen it infiltrating the police. So we saw this infamous, notorious case involving Christian Prinsloo, who was responsible for, you know, acquiring firearms that had been surrendered through amnesty to the police and they were supposed to be destroyed. And on the sort of database, it showed that they'd been destroyed, but actually they were sold on through criminal networks. And those went straight to gangs, and that just kind of made things highly problematic from a murder rate, especially in Cape Town and in Nelson Mandela Bay. But also police stations being targeted by organized criminal groups where they've kind of, you know, planned ahead and gone for that. But also police men and women are also targets for having their weapons stolen. So, you know, police are a kind of a prominent player in all of this.
So in the past, and you sort of alluded to this, there has been a time when there's been a large number of guns in our society, and we were able, I think, at some point to reduce the number of guns. It was a very different time. So as you say, a lot of those guns were coming from Mozambique. This was after a series of liberation wars, not just here, but also in Mozambique and other places. Would it be possible to use any of the measures we used then to reduce the number of guns in circulation now?
I mean, the one thing there were multiple things that happened, but was really important if we look sort of at the early 2000s, late 1990s, where at the sort of heights of sort of firearm murders and other forms of firearm violence, and it comes down quite significantly from 2000 to about 2008, 2009, and then starts to gradually increase. And sort of what happens in that period is a combination of things. It's, the state comes up with a new firearms plan, and the plan is very much to sort of target the problems around firearms control, so looking at the legislation, but also looking at the policing. So there's a lot of effort put into the policing. We had big operations, such as Operation Saturnia, that looked to target high crime areas where there was a lot of gun violence and gun crime and illegal ownership, and sort of using sort of saturation policing, going in there, arresting those in possession of illegal firearms, confiscating those firearms, and particularly focusing on high crime areas. And then you sort of saw the rates coming down. I mean, this particular point in time, guns were fairly easily available. So you would see, not, sort of the interventions would make a difference on gun violence. I mean, what we're seeing these days is you're still seeing these operations taking place, but those who have illegal guns are protecting them a lot more effectively than was happening during the early 2000s. So it's this combination of kind of police operations, but the improvement on the law. So what we suddenly saw in the early 1990s was fairly loose laws around firearm registration, so it made it quite easy for anyone over the age of 16 to acquire a firearm. They changed that in the early 2000s, so less and less people could access firearms. So it meant because less people could access firearms, there was a decrease in the diversion of firearms. So that had an impact as well.
I mean, I remember as a teenager, I think when I was 16 and got a green ID book, they had space for 5 firearm licenses at the age of 16. And was still 2 years before I was allowed to drive. One of the things that's important, maybe important, is the type of gun. So, and we've seen a huge conversation around this in the United States. I don't know if that helps us. It's one thing to have a revolver, right? So that's a sort of single shot. Maybe it can fire a few shots at once, but it's not an automatic. I know very little about guns, so excuse me. But there's another thing where someone has, an Uzi or an AK-47 that can fire an automatic and go to a tavern and shoot a large number of people very quickly. Do we have a problem as well with the type of gun that's available to criminals?
Well, it's yes and no. I mean, for example, in the U.S. it's very different to most other countries. In the U.S. you can get these semi-automatic rifles, and there's technology. You can convert them very easily to fully automatic. In the case of South Africa, it's quite difficult to get hold of a fully automatic weapon. This would have something that would have had to be stolen from the military, or would have had to have been buried in a cache from the kind of, sort of period of the 1980s when, the apartheid sort of covert operations were supplying weapons to Inkatha and other kind of hit squads, and you had weapons being smuggled across through kind of ANC cells. So some of those weapons are still floating around. Some of them, for example, were left with the TBVC states militaries, and their arsenals kind of disappeared into parts of the Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng. So there's that kind of history to that. But generally, it's quite difficult to get hold of fully automatic weapons. I mean, semi-automatics are available if you're able to obviously access police armories, or you're able to access and steal from private security companies that deal with kind of asset and transit stuff. And they've typically got semi-automatics, which means they're high caliber magazines, so they can, have a large number of ammunition rounds within them. And you can, fire quite a lot of those rounds within a short space of time, but it's not fully automatic in the sense that you depress the trigger and it just keeps on firing. So that's where you've so often seen kind of criminals accessing those types of weapons, or they've been these kind of, the ones that have been around for a number of decades and they've been maintained. Because that's the issue with many weapons, is particularly AK-47s and similar type AK weapons, is that they're serviceable for decades. As long as you kind of keep them clean, they can just keep on firing. And accessing the ammunition, particularly if you can get hold of, 7.62 ammunition, if you can get hold of it through, kind of military sources, through kind of corruption involved in private security of the police, then you can have this kind of effect.
It's very tempting, and I'm someone who's never owned a gun at all. It's very tempting to just say that anyone who's found with a gun should immediately go to jail, and the gun should just simply be destroyed. And the only people allowed guns, maybe not even private security guards, just police officers. I mean, with that kind of extreme stance work, you would probably start with a few amnesties, maybe more than one over, say, a 5-year period, and then move to quite a strong, very restrictive law with very harsh punishments. And I know immediately the argument that will come is that then the only people who would have guns would be criminals, would be the argument, I suppose.
I mean, the situation at the moment is, those who are found in possession of an illegal firearm, don't have a license, have a criminal record, then there's a very good chance that they're going to go to jail. And then, it's sort of 10 years for, legal possession of a firearm. What's been happening in South Africa is the sort of sense of really trying to restrict access over the years. So, it was fairly easy to get a firearm. You could get, large numbers of firearms prior to 2000, fairly large access to ammunition. That's been restricted over the years, and what government is trying to do through the new law is they've said, well, the problem we're facing from a diversion point of view of weapons that are going into criminal hands, it's largely handguns. And it's particularly those, the most risky category of handgun owners, those who, most vulnerable of having their weapons taken off them by criminals, are those who acquired firearms for self-defense. So, of course, you've got people who've got firearms for hunting, firearms for sports shooting, but, of course, there's a large majority of licensed firearm owners who get it for self-defense. So what the state is trying to do is to say, well, you can no longer acquire a firearm for self-defense, and that's sitting in the new amendments, proposed amendments to the Firearms Act. But of course, that's a whole hornet's nest around this issue, hundreds of thousands of complaints about it. So trying to do that, I think is going to be a long haul. And I think there are many things that can be done before that. I mean, many issues around the inefficiency within the administration of licenses. The background checks aren't as efficient as they should be. There's kind of many issues around policing operations and illegal firearms. We could be doing a lot more around that. But ultimately we do have a very serious gun problem in South Africa, and we do need to be looking at ways and means of preventing firearms from getting into criminal hands.
Dr. Guy Lamb, thank you. Criminologist in the Politics Department at the University of Stellenbosch. Really do appreciate it.